Okay, hello chess players. So today we're going to go over the King's Indian beginning after d4, knight f6, pawn to c4, g6. That begins the King's Indian. And we're going to be specifically looking at the Fianchetto variation of the King's Indian, which can happen after any number of move orders. But the main move order that we're going to be taking a look at is knight to f3, bishop g7, and then pawn to g3. This begins the Fianchetto system. Anyways, if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button and click on the notification icon. So somebody was asking me about this the other day. They were going, hey, what do I do against these Catalan setups? I have no idea what to do if people just play the Catalan against the King's Indian. Well, it's actually not that complicated. I mean, the only complicated part is that they can do this from like a number of different move orders, so you have to know all the different move orders. But basically, you can just play d5, and you can transpose this into a Grünfeld, and you can equalize pretty easily. The idea behind d5 is just you're going to play a Grünfeld type setup. Eventually, this d pawn and this c pawn are going to get exchanged. White is going to end up with his bishop on the long diagonal, but the bishop is going to be hitting air. Whereas black's bishop is going to have targets. He's going to have like a target on d4, possibly a target on c3, etc. So black should be equal fairly easily. And I've got a couple of stem games coming from this position. I have Nikolic versus Kasparov, and I have Van Weely versus Carlsen. They both continued with cd5, knight d5, bishop g2, knight b6, knight c3, knight c6, castles. And now here Kasparov was really brave. Kasparov took on d4, and he equalized fairly easily. After knight takes d4, knight d4, queen d4, we had knight b5, which creates a lot of complications, but Kasparov navigates those complications pretty easily. He plays queen c4, which counterattacks the knight and protects c7. We have a4 protecting that knight. Then we have castles, b3, queen g4. The rook on a1 is hanging to the bishop, so white is have to gonna play some very aggressive sort of active moves. And he does that for a while, but then he makes an error somewhere. He plays bishop to e3. We have bishop e6. We have knight c7. This allows the counterattack with rook a d8, queen b1, and then we have bishop a1, queen a1, bishop takes b3. There's apparently slight edge black. Black has the threats of going queen a4, and white, of course, has the counter threats of playing bishop h6, picking back up his exchange because he's threatening mate. Now, even if black loses his exchange, that's not a big deal. We're going to give the exchange back, and we're going to have a couple extra pawns on the queen side. This should yield some sort of advantage for black, and the engine backs this up. The engine says this position is already slight edge black. And in Nikolic versus Kasparov, played in Wickenzy back in 2000, Kasparov did go on to win with the black pieces. Now, against castles, you don't need to go into the complications with knight takes d4. Magnus Carlsen certainly didn't back in 2015 when he played Van Weely and Wickenzy. He played instead this move castles kingside. And then after d5, he continued with knight a5. Queen c2, c6, dc6, knight c6 should be completely equal, but Magnus Carlsen pressed from here, because he always does, and he eventually went on to win with the black pieces. That was Van Weely versus Magnus Carlsen, played in Wickenzy back in 2015. So I know a lot of you guys are wondering, like, what about all these other different move orders that people can try? Like, okay, g6, what if they play knight c3? Knight c3, bishop g7, knight f3, castles, g3. We can do the same thing. We can still play d5. This was played in Cariana versus Bashir-Lagrave, played back in 2016. That game continued cd5, knight d5, bishop g2. And now, of course, knight b6 just transposes. It's a direct transposition, so you can play knight b6 and just play the same lines. But it is also possible to play c5, and that's what was played in Cariana versus Lagrave, played back in 2016. That game continued castles, knight c3, bc3, and then knight c6 was already almost completely equal. Again, the point being black has these counterattacking chances against this pawn on d4. In a lot of ways, this is very similar to what happened in the game between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann, that very controversial game that Magnus Carlsen lost, and he basically accused Hans Niemann of cheating. These are very difficult positions for white to play. Black has an easy position. White has a much more complicated position. White's playing this Catalan setup where he has a lot of pressure on the d4 square, and his bishop on g2 is actually just really just hitting nothing but air, as it turns out. So these are actually sort of hard positions for whites to play, and black tends to equalize very easily in these positions, and a lot of times can press for an advantage if white makes one tiny error. So this was Cariana versus Bashir-Lagrave, played on chess.com back in 2016. Black did eventually go on to win in this game, but at this point, it's just equal, or relatively close to equal. So anyways, what other things can happen? What other things can white try? I know a lot of you are probably already screaming at your screen, well, what if they don't let me play d5? What if they play something like knight c3, bishop g7, and then they play pawn to e4, which will effectively prevent d5? Well, if they play pawn to e4, and then they still try to take up a fianchetto system with, say, knight f3 and then g3, it's actually sort of a strategic error, and it goes all the way back to the way people used to play these systems. If we go back to the other move order, we'll call it like the main move order, with knight to f3, bishop g7, and then let's say knight c3, castles, and then we have g3, d6. This is how people used to play this with the black pieces. They used to play the King's Indian setup with d6, and we're going way, way back in the way, way back machine. I've got a game here, Capablanca versus Tyler, played in Nottingham all the way back in 1936. And this is a really critical game to understand the theory of the move pawn to d6, and to understand these pano setups, and to understand the setups that involve d6 and c5, and of course, it's sister moves d6, knight c6, followed by eventually knight a5. So in this particular game, the game continued with bishop to g2, and then black played the move that everybody played black then. Black played the move knight to c6. And his idea was after knight c6, after castles, he wanted to play the move bishop g4. Now it turns out that bishop g4 is a mistake. But what's important to understand is why bishop g4 is a mistake, and also to understand why people are playing bishop g4 to begin with. Why were people trying this all the way back in 1936? Well, the idea behind bishop g4 is pretty straightforward. Black is going for something like he wants h3. Like, let's say h3, bishop f3, and then he wants to play the knight back to d7, and he's putting some pressure on d4, and he's preparing to play e5 and f5 and get the normal types of King's Indian counterattacking chances that you would get, where you're going to get this kingside attack and you're going to go after white, and it's going to be an interesting game. This is what people wanted to do. So this makes sense, but what Capablanca did is he basically refuted this idea, because of course Capablanca is a genius, and we all want to be like Capablanca, but none of us can be. But he basically refuted this whole idea with this very brilliant strategic / positional concept. He played this move pawn to d5. And after pawn to d5, of course, probably the best move is to play something like knight to a5 and hit this pawn on c4, and then eventually play pawn to c5 later. But when you go and you play that strategy, eventually the correct location for this bishop is not going to be on g4, it's going to be on d7, because white's going to remove his knight, he's going to play the knight back on f3 back to d2, and then this bishop is going to feel uncomfortable on g4, and it's going to want to come back to d7 to support the eventual a6 and b5, which leads to the question, why did you put it on g4 in the first place? You know, why didn't you just leave it on c8 and then just move it to d7 in one move instead of moving it to d7 in two moves? It doesn't make any sense at all. So Tyler actually played the more logical move here. Once you've played bishop g4, it's more logical to follow through and to play bishop takes f3. And then, of course, this is the idea he missed. Capablanca took back with the pawn. He doesn't take back with the bishop. And that's why it's important to have this pawn on the e2 square so that you can take back with the pawn and not take back with the bishop. If you take back with the bishop, black's, of course, doing fine. So the main idea here is white will eventually put tons and tons of pressure on the e7 square. White's going to build up his position with pawn to f4, bishop e3, etc. He's going to have two really powerful slicing and dicing bishops, and he's also going to be able to put pressure on black's camp, and black is going to have less space in general. So the game continued knight e5, queen b3, knight fd7, bishop e3, b6, knight b5, c5, dc6, knight c6, f4, and then we've got the slicing and dicing bishops. Clearly, Capablanca has some sort of advantage here. We have queen to c8, queen a4, and then we have knight c5, and then we have a mistake from white. White should have just retreated his queen. His queen's under attack. Just play queen c2. Queen c2 should be major advantage white all day long. Instead, Capablanca made this mistake. He played bishop c5, bc5, knight c3, knight d4 was a brilliant move that equalized. And the main justification is you don't have bishop a8 because queen a8 would be major advantage black. We have the knight coming into f3. This is awesome. But Capablanca was smarter than that. He played rook e1. The position is equal, but you know he's Capablanca. His opponent isn't Capablanca, so Capablanca still went on to win. So even though black managed to get that miracle equality, but nonetheless, black should not be doing this. Black should not be playing this bishop g4 idea without that pawn on the e2 square. So if we play bishop g4 and the pawn's on e2, we constantly have to worry about e captures f3. Of course, knight a5 is a better move here, but why play bishop g4 in the first place? So that's basically how you deal with people when they play an early e4. And if you do want to play this King's Indian type setup, like if you want to play this setup with a6, knight c6, etc., what you should do is you should approach it from this slightly different move order. You should play bishop g7, and then after g3, you should play castles, and then bishop g2, and then you should play d6. And now what you're trying to achieve is you're trying to achieve something very similar to what Kasparov achieved against Belyavsky. But you're trying to achieve the Belyavsky-Kasparov game, and if you're not familiar with that game continued knight c3, and then Kasparov played c5. This was the old way that people used to play this. They used to play c5. I don't recommend this move order, simply because people can play dc5, and they can turn this into really, really boring chess, and it's terrible, because white does have a slight advantage here. But back in the Belyatsky versus Kasparov games, the game continued castles, knight c6, d5, knight a5, knight d2. And now you have sort of these standard ideas. You know, you have a6, you have b5, you have the knight hitting the c4 square, you have potentially e5, and then you have bishop h6 hitting the knight on d2, so you can put more pressure on the c4 square. And this is what happened in Balyatsky versus Kasparov, played in Linares all the way back in 1994. And that game was super interesting. That game continued with e5 from Kasparov. Then we had b3. We had bishop to d7. Notice how I mentioned before, bishop going to d7 in one move, kind of a big deal. We want to support d5. So that was Kasparov's idea. And then we have bishop to b2, knight g4, h3, knight back to h6, e3, f5, f4, a6, queen c2, b5 turned out to be a super interesting position. The computer still gives this as very slight edge white, but of course there's a lot going on here. Black is attacking on c4, black is attacking in the middle, black has counterattacking chances on the king side. The game did eventually end in a draw, but there was a lot of twists and turns and a lot of room for improvement for both sides. So that was Belyatsky versus Kasparov, played in Linares back in 1994. But as I pointed out, if you're going for this, I don't recommend the c5 move order because they might play dc5. So what I recommend is this super flexible move order beginning with the move pawn to a6, which is basically trying to get to the exact same position, but I'm trying to do it after knight c3, knight c6. Now if they play d5, I'm going to play knight a5. The whole point being that I'm hitting c4, they still have to play knight d2, and then c5, and I've managed to get this position without the possibility of the dx c5 exchange, and it's essentially the exact same position. I can follow the Belyatsky versus Kasparov game if I want to, or I can play something completely different. Another benefit of this particular move order is I'm trying to coax white into possibly, or giving white as many opportunities as possible to move this pawn. And I had a couple of good games in this situation, or white made the strategic error of moving this pawn. And this will also help people understand why moving the pawn from e2 to e4 is a bad idea. And if they do move the pawn from e2 to e4 in the early opening and then they fianchetto, you can approach it basically with the same idea that I played here, which is I had an opponent play pawn to e3 against me. This was Veach versus Plunkett, played in the Minnesota Open back in 2010. The only reason I'm showing my own game here is because I can't really find a ton of grandmaster games where grandmasters make this very basic strategic error of removing the pawn from the e2 square, because they do know that they have to be able to recapture on f3 with that pawn, going all the way back to that Capablanca game. So here I immediately play bishop g4, taking advantage of the fact that now he has to recapture with the bishop. So bishop g4, h3, bishop f3, bishop f3, and then this is my idea, knight d7. I want to play e5, f5, and I know that I have an interesting game. Now I think according to the engine, it says that everything should still be, fine, because of course everything in chess is fine. But black is getting the exact type of game he wants. Black is getting this super aggressive attacking game with e5 and f5, and you're getting your normal type of King's Indian attacking, counterattacking position. So the game continued rook b1, e5, d5, knight e7, e4, and then I played f5. So according to the engine, white still has a very, very slight edge, but of course black has tons and tons of attacking chances. This is the exact type of position we're going for. And after my opponent played b4, I played b6, a4, a5, bishop a3, a b4, bishop takes b4. The engine now thinks the position is equal. So apparently white's last couple of moves were mistakes, because it just does not take very much in these types of positions to go from slight edge to equality. But I could have equalized with knight f6, and this is apparently completely equal. I played for an attack. I played f4 because that's kind of the spirit of the opening. We just play for attacking chances. The game continued bishop g4, h5, bishop e6, king h7, g4, and then I play this extremely trappy move. I play pawn to f3, and my opponent blunders right into my idea. He plays pawn to g5, which is, of course, a huge mistake. It falls into, pause the video, see if you can find it. Knight takes d5, completely winning, and my opponent was a sport about it. Queen g5's hanging, but he doesn't have a good move here, so I guess he just decided that he didn't want to resign, so he just played c takes d5, queen g5, and then queen g2 is mate. So that's one possibility, if they play pawn to e3. Now, they might not play pawn to e3, they might play something else here. They might play something like queen to d3. I had this a couple months later, so it was like I was playing this in the Minnesota Close Championship, so probably my opponent in the Minnesota Close Championship, it was Thomas Ulrich was playing the white pieces. Um, I can only assume that he saw the game, and maybe he thought queen d3 was some sort of improvement. I don't know if maybe he didn't see the game. I don't know. But what I played against queen d3 was I played bishop f5, and I'm trying to coax that exact same positional error. I'm hitting the queen with my bishop, and I'm just hoping that my opponent will play pawn to e4, And then again, that pawn will no longer be defending that knight on the f3 square. So after I play bishop f5, I was lucky. My opponent did play e4. I immediately play bishop g4. Same idea. h3, bishop f3, bishop f3, knight d7. Same idea, gaining the tempo on d4. Bishop e3, e5, d5, knight d4, bishop g2, and then c5, dc6, bc6. We have pawn to f4, rook b8, rook f2, queen a5, rook f1, queen b4 hitting the pawn on b2, b3, knight to c5 hits the queen, so this is all with tempo, and then after queen d2, I uncork a pretty cool idea. I sacrifice a piece, but the main idea is actually to eventually sacrifice my whole queen, and I'll end up having a rook and a bishop for the queen, but my opponent's king will be unsafe, and I'll have eliminated most of white's pawns. So that idea was knight on c captures b3. And amazingly, the engine backs this up. So I played this cool sack, and the engine says it's good. So apparently this is slight edge black. So the idea is a b3, I play knight b3, my opponent plays queen d3, and then my idea was e takes f4, so I'm hitting the bishop on e3, hitting the knight on c3, and my opponent has to do something. He comes up with the idea of counterattacking my queen, and I'm like, okay, fine, you can have my queen. So I play pawn takes f3, pawn takes e3, knight takes on f2, takes, and then rook takes b4. So now I have a rook and a minor piece for the queen, but I also have a couple of pawns, and my opponent's king is more unsafe. So as it turns out, black's position is probably better. And I did eventually go on to win, and I'm just going to show the rest of that game just so you know how to win these types of positions. Queen d6 takes. e5, I played knight d4. Rook a4, I played knight to f5 hitting the queen. I played rook to a3, again going after that weak king. We have e6. I take with check, and then I throw in a couple more checks, and then when I come back and take this pawn, the game's pretty much all over. I'm attacking the queen. I'm also threatening bishop e3 check. I'm also threatening several different mating nets, because now this king is walking into different mating nets here. So we had queen f3, bishop e3 check, king over to c2, takes. One of the main problems in this position is this king is super unsafe, and my king is just very well protected. He just can't get to it. So here we have rook c8, rook check, rook over, and then this last move pretty much ends the game. I'm threatening to play here with mate, and white just doesn't have a good move here, so white resign. So that's kind of what you're trying to do with this a6 and then say knight c3, knight c6, is you're trying to coax white into playing one of these early e2 or e4 moves to where bishop g4 is a good idea. And of course, that's how you reply to one of the early e2 or e3 or e4 moves if they play this early in the early on in the game where they don't allow you to play pawn to d5. You would take advantage of it by just simply playing these old lines and then eventually throwing in bishop to g4. So going back to this main line, I want to give like my full recommendation here. So d5, knight a5, we're going to have knight d2, c5, queen c2, rook b8, b3, b5, bishop b2. So sort of my full recommendation in this line is to play sort of a hybrid of what Kasparov played, but to add like a little bit of a twist to it, taking a look at sort of what the modern engines think about this position, because there are a ton of different possibilities for how black can continue to play this position. But mainly, I think that you should go with e5. I think this is reasonable. I don't think that there's a ton of improvements on this. And I think that, white's typically going to play something like rook ae1. And now at this point, I do think that the move bishop h6, sort of similar to what Kasparov was playing back in the day, is a good idea. We get rid of this dark squared bishop. We planted all our pawns on dark squares. This makes perfect strategic sense. And then after a move like, say, bishop to c1, I think we should continue with knight h5, and then after e4, I think we should actually take on c4 so we can go after that square. We should play rook to b4 so we can go after that square some more. And after knight d1, I think we should play f5. And in my database, this position has never been played, but this is the recommendation according to Stockfish, and it gives the closest assessment to equal that I can find. And of course, there's a lot of complications going on here. We have the traditional attack against c4, and we have our counterattacking chances with the pawn on e4. We're going to be getting rid of our bad bishop at some point. The bishop on h6, we're going to be trying to get rid of it for something, whether it be the knight or the bishop. And since all our pawns are located on dark squares, that's going to be a good thing. So it gives this as we'll just call it unclear, but it's the closest assessment to equal that I have. Now, all that being said, there's tons and tons of room for exploration within these positions. People have tried a ton of different things. A lot of different moves have been trendy over the years. It's very fertile ground to explore, kind of even just beginning from this position. You have a lot of fertile ground to explore from here. Tons of different tries have happened from here, and there's a lot of fertile ground to explore. But My recommendation is sort of based off of what the current computer assessment is and what Stockfish gives. But the short answer to this video is if you do come across the Fianchetto system, it's nothing to be feared. Uh, you can equalize fairly easily in these lines. By of course, like when they play the early G3, you can just play an early D5, turn it into a Grünfeld and equalize fairly easily. And of course, if they play an early E4 with G3, that's nothing to fear because Bishop G4 should be leading to the types of positions where Black is very happy with the complications. And like I said, I've won a number of games in those situations where I play this traditional plan of playing Bishop G4 taking and bringing the knight back to D7 with E5 and F5 coming. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess, and I hope you can use some of these ideas in your own games. Thank you very much for watching.